All right, so hi everybody. This is New York Families for Tomorrow. I'm here with Dr. Jennifer Harman, who, if you follow our page and you are aware of our resources and services, you know who she is. She introduces herself quite well. So Jennifer, go ahead if you want to give just a quick intro for everybody who may not know who you are.
Okay. My name is Dr. Jennifer Harman, and I'm an associate professor of psychology at Colorado State University. And I've been studying the topic of parental alienation and family violence now for over 10 years now, I think is where I'm at. And that's me. Yeah.
So. Well, thank you. Thank you for taking this time to just kind of talk with our organization, just to put the information out there, the awareness out there. You know, what's new, what's current, where is it going, you know, anything that we could do to help the future of addressing this concern that we'd like to call parental alienation and what it is. So I guess my first question would be, you know, as we were just discussing kind of behind the scenes, integrity, and how important is it today to acknowledge and or cite updated and credible journal sources through, so, you know, for just me, like a layman person, if I'm citing something or a fact or a quote, how important it is to use credible, updated, recent studies in terms of bringing awareness?
Oh, I can't even probably, I can't even, like, I guess, underestimate or overestimate how important it is. I guess is a better word of saying. Not all journals are the same. If somebody's even published in a peer-reviewed journal, you have to look at what kind of journal it is. Is it a scientific journal or is it a professional journal? If it's a professional journal, it's usually published on behalf of an association or an organization that has its own agenda. And so if it's a scientific peer-reviewed journal, meaning that the people who review it are other scientists who are evaluating the merits of and the scientific integrity of the work, and they have usually good indices of those journals to let you know whether it's a good journal or not, then that would be, I would put a lot more faith in what is reported there than in any other type of journal. And so it does require homework on people's part. You can't just look at a headline on a social media page or a post and think, oh, it's just like being critical of your news sources. You know, you can't just go and, you know, post, you know, not all news web pages are legit. You know,
Right.
not all, you know, news sources are actually real, you know, news outlets. They're, you know, propaganda pages. The same thing we see here. We see it across every, not even just research on parental alienation. We see this with other scientific disciplines too, like, you know, climate change. I mean, there's so many deniers out there about it, and their sources are, you know,
Wonky.
weak at best.
Yeah.
You know, and yet they cite it, and we see that with alienation, and it's getting worse.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Bill Burnett published a paper this fall where he tracked one misstatement or one totally false statement that was published by somebody, and it cannot be attributed to any person who's ever studied parental alienation. So they made a deliberate, I don't know if you would call it a lie or a fabrication, or totally misquoted the work of what parental alienation is. And he tracked this one statement across multiple publications, and finding that the same people are repeating the same quote over and over and over again. And a lot of them are appearing in one particular journal, which I think I'm kind of calling it the National Enquirer of the publications out there. And it's the journal that was formerly known as the Journal of Child Custody. Now it's the Journal of Family Trauma, and it's a really long name. And the editorial board is made up of primarily only people who are the critics of parental alienation.
Okay.
And they mostly only publish opinion pieces.
Okay.
So it's if you ever see something from that journal, I would not rely on
Okay.
anything that I would not give it any validity at all.
Right, right.
Personally, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. I mean, as an undergrad student now, in writing some research papers for social research, you know, we are held to even a high standard of what we can use, even at the undergraduate level. And it can get frustrating at times, but like you said, it's really important to do your due diligence and do your homework and look into like where the resource comes from, because the last thing you want is to waste your time, someone else's time, and or put false information out there to the world that may or may not be harmful to a cause or a mission or a research project that someone's working on. So
right. Yeah, you always, especially you raise a really good point there, because when you read what somebody else wrote, you should always look at who they're citing. Like, so, because it'll appear like, oh, look, I have all this scientific support for the things I'm saying. But when you actually look at the citations that are used to support it, A, you find out that that's not what the person actually said, or B, it's like not a reputable source. It's like a website.
yeah,
Or a book written by somebody who lost their license, like a completely discredited person. And yet, if you don't know that, and this is why peer review, when we say peer review, what that really means is you have other scientists or other scientific peers who not only know the methods and the statistics and other things that the person uses, but they know the literature and they can look for those problems. So when an article is accepted in a good journal, it means that the people who reviewed it like said, yes, their citations and everything that they're using is completely valid. It's supported in the empirical research. It's not just citing some website or somebody's opinion, right?
some pie chart somewhere.
And so it's not just like, oh, it's good research that's published there, but it's been vetted. It's been looked at very closely by people who really know the field and really know that research literature to know whether or not the arguments are valid.
Yeah, and that's important. That is definitely important, especially when we're trying to move the marker for something that is, I'm going to use quotes, quote unquote, new to a climate like family law. When something is introduced new, it's really important to withstand that credibility and that integrity, I think, for the long haul. As you've seen, it gets attacked and it gets, blemished and it gets argued, and but at the end of the day, you maintain that integrity and credibility throughout the process. I really do believe that it will prevail. At the end.
Well, especially if, across all sciences, there's a real, there's been a movement for about a decade to increase transparency and really make the whole process a lot clearer so people don't make up data, they don't manipulate their data, they don't, do things that make their results appear more significant than they are. And so, for example, almost all my studies now that I do, I pre-register. That's what we call where you detail what you're going to do, your hypotheses, and you put it out into an archive or like there's a website called Open Science Framework. That's where I put all my stuff. And so then that way I can't go and cheat. I can't go and like make up my data.
Yeah.
I can't go and like test different hypotheses that match my results.
Right.
I have to only test what I predicted ahead of time. And this is something that's been happening across all the sciences. This isn't unique to psychology or anywhere else. And I think if we can start expecting that and demanding that of everybody who does research, particularly in this area, you're going to start to see that a lot of the evidence used by critics of parental alienation just doesn't hold up.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that sounds like a great mechanism to kind of decrease some of the fraudulent, activities that happen in the scientific field. So yeah, that's great that exists and you're using that.
Like one good example of, just contrasting, I published a paper in Psychology, Public Policy and Law, where we tried to we tried to replicate the results of that Joan Meier and her colleagues had published in an archived paper. It wasn't peer reviewed.
Okay.
It didn't, in fact, we verified with the editor that it wasn't reviewed by anybody. It was just posted onto their archive. So it wasn't reviewed by anybody. But on the second or the 6th page of the paper, there's a quote of how they, quote, analyzed their data. And she said that they essentially played with their models. They added variables and other things until it got the results that they wanted. And then they tweaked the models until so it would amplify certain results. Now that is horrifying because that's what we call p-hacking. That's manipulating your statistical models to get what you want.
Oof.
And then, you know, just throwing things into your model until you get as strong of effective as you want. And that's not a valid, that is a completely like that's retractable worthy. Like if that was submitted to a journal, like a scientific journal, and it was found out that people did that, they would withdraw that paper because it would not be valid. But because her paper was never peer reviewed, she'll never withdraw it. Whereas, you know, contrast that with what we did when we replicated it, all our statistical models are on open science framework. Anybody could see what we did.
Yeah.
You know, we predicted what we did. All our statistics, all our data are there. Anybody can go on there and look at what we did and replicate it.
Yeah.
And yet when we have asked her for her information, she has refused to give it to us.
Yeah.
So
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised, you know, in terms of our communication efforts with anybody who sits on the New York State Blue Ribbon Commission, which is a panel or a board that was put together by our axed governor, Andrew Cuomo, to look at family court and see how they can go about to, you know, make some slight changes, reform, gather some data to see where they can improve some things. And Joan Meier sits on that board. And so, you know, you would think that a board that was set up in the public eye to perform those checks and balances on a public system would have more transparency and offer that open communication, especially with nonprofits and organizations like National Parents Organization. You know, we're trying to get data. We're not trying to hurt you. We're we're trying to make sure that everything is lined up within advocacy, PR, and science. So we can come up with this plan, this policy agenda to make sure that we're effectively walking in the right direction. And unfortunately, what we see here is because of, you know, published opinion pieces by Joan Meier and current bills that are trying to be passed in New York State, we're missing that communication and transparency piece to know if we're on the right path in reforming family court law. So it makes it very difficult to have those measures in place to say, okay, yeah, this is working, or this is going to work this way. Let's do it like this. It's very difficult to adhere to any kind of policy framework when a big chunk of what you need is not playing ball with you. And there's reasons for that. I'm not going to get into the reasons for that because, you know, I could be here all day talking about the corruption of New York State and or family court law in general, but I don't want to focus on that. So along with the credibility and integrity of studies, would you agree it's important to maybe stay away from, you know, in terms of using social media and or PR campaigns, maybe staying away from quoting or using studies that are 10 years older? Like, what's your take on trying to find the most current and relevant information out there and using it? Or is it okay to use the historical stuff?
Well, there's always good classic studies, right, that were well conducted, provide a groundwork and basis for what we know today. I can say that there's a paper that we have that we're about to resubmit. We just finished revising it, or I'm finishing up revising it right now. And what we found is that there's over 200 separate studies just looking at parental alienation, even though we know parental alienation is, it captures lots of other fields of study like that don't call themselves parental alienation. Like, you know, for example, gatekeeping. There's a lot of research on gatekeeping behaviors. And that's one of many parental alienating behaviors. It's just, it doesn't go by that word. So there's like so much research that's associated with parental alienation that are pieces of it, but they just don't call themselves that, right? And so when we only look at just those studies that only call themselves parental alienation, there's still a lot of research. And what we found is that about 40% of what we know today has been published since 2016.
Okay.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah.
And that's including work published in 10 other languages. So there's, I mean, people are publishing this all over the world. Like there's a lot of people publishing, you know, a lot of scientists publishing out of Brazil, for example. And there's been studies, you know, even published in Czech. I mean, you know, there's, I mean, and a lot of it, not a lot, but I'd say about, I'm like spitballing it off the top of my head from what I was looking at earlier this morning. But I think about 15 or 20% of what we know is from doctoral dissertations and theses, which a lot of people kind of like shrug that off as like not as valid, but it's gone through a very rigorous review process with other PhDs. It usually has a lot more data and information because doctoral students, PhD students have to collect a lot of information and prove, you know, that they know what they're doing. And C, I mean, a lot of the people who do this work are clinicians, and a lot of clinicians go into private practice after they graduate, and they're not incentivized to publish their dissertations. So when we exclude those and we don't look at them, we're missing a lot of really important research that's actually been conducted that just didn't, the person just didn't go the next step and go to publish it in a journal. But usually they're actually very well-designed studies. And so, but a lot of it, there's like 165 or so separate peer-reviewed studies that have been published since, you know, as far back as we could find. But those are only the studies that actually use the term parental alienation. And so it doesn't include all these other, like I find a lot of studies call it loyalty conflicts in their title. But yet it is a different thing. But when you actually look at what they studied, they're studying parental alienation. So there's just a lot. I think the terminology has been evolving, and we're starting to kind of settle on the terminology. But then the critics of parental alienation use that as a weakness, even though it's not a weakness. It's a normal development of any scientific field where terminologies change. You know, what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder, it wasn't called that 100 years ago.
No.
You know? Right. You know, I mean, so, you know, our terminology changes the more we learn, you know, the more we really understand what we're looking at. And as scientists, we have to differentiate, you know, sometimes they'll call it just loyalty conflicts, where a child is stuck in the middle between two parents. And in a lot of the developmental psych literature, they'll say things like, well, the child either distances themselves from the parents because they don't want to deal with their conflict, or they align with one parent and they pick a side. So what they're describing in that second example is parental alienation.
Yeah.
So when they call loyalty conflicts, they're describing two different processes. They're describing kids stuck in the middle versus an alienated child, and those are two different things.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So our definitions change. Yeah, the more specific, the more we understand, the more specific we get in our definitions.
Right. And it seems like that is, you know, you should be allowed that time to process all that too. It seems like it also seems like doctors and researchers and PhDs, you know, in this field of study of PA, it seems like the opposing view is hurry up and you better like prove this now, or we're not going to look at it. And I think that's an injustice also that happens. And
then the goalposts get raised all the time. So first there was a criticism that the intervention research, like program evaluations of programs that are parental, like designed to treat children who've been alienated, they say, oh, they're not empirically based. But what they do is they say it's not empirically based, even though empirically based means it's based on what's best known practices and what we best know in the research. And I could tell you all the interventions that have been designed are based on that. They're based on what we know at the time as best practices and the best research. But then they say, well, it hasn't been evaluated. Okay, well, we don't hold that standard up for domestic violence programs all the time.
Right.
Most of them haven't been evaluated, or even a lot of child abuse programs. Some of them have, but a lot of them haven't. You don't see them going and like trying to, tear down those interventions, right? And then then the next argument now is, oh, well, there's not any, all they've relied on are self-reports. So you can't really rely on the self-report of parents and the children, because of course they're being biased. So then what? So then, Dr. Warshak, he's like, okay, well, we have the parents, the children, and the professionals, and get the professionals' opinions who are involved in the intervention. Oh, but then that's not good enough. That's biased, because of course the professionals. So then I publish an evaluation where we actually had the videos of the intervention, like where you can see what's happening during the actual intervention to see, are these kids being traumatized? Are they being brainwashed? Are they being terrified, like ripped apart from their parent, like all these things that Jean Mercer's been complaining. Well, when you look at the videos, that's not what's happening at all. And we didn't even have self-report. We used videos. We actually had people code the videos and look at what was happening. But that's not good enough. Now they say, okay, well, then now there's not a comparison group. All right, so now I'm doing another program evaluation where we have a comparison group, a good one. But that's still not going to be enough.
No.
Because the problem is the people who are raising these criticisms are never going to be swayed from their position.
Right.
They're not. They don't want to see it. Like any evidence you throw at them, they don't see any value in it, or they undermine it completely.
Well, and I think that also has to do with the clash between legal perspectives and social perspectives, and I see that a lot in family court, and really any court. I mean, even in criminal justice court. I mean, you could see the clash there with their restorative measures and what they're trying to do with that, that aspect. Same thing. And in family court, it's really the social buttonhead of the legal. And you have two sets of groups that, go in there and they're, instead of all working together to promote, that healthier, safer environment, they're too busy fighting each other, and they create this, as we know, this adversarial approach. And it's not even the actors, the parents and the kids that are actively participating in this. It's those clashes of those perspectives that come in play, and then the parents and the kids, they don't know how to act. They're totally disconnected from the process. At least in my experience of talking, I've probably talked to over 100 parents over the past year and their experiences in family court, and they're just completely disconnected with the process, and relying on online sources, attorneys, judges, friends, social workers to fill in those gaps for them. But then, you have the social workers and the friends fill in the social perspective, then your attorneys come in with the legal perspective, and you're kind of at odds with yourself, right? And you're like, you don't know what to do. And it's very sad to see, because, at the end of the day, if they were to accept these studies and accept this issue and take it and work with it and apply it, I really feel that we could offer families a more holistic approach to divorce and separation and custody.
Right. Well, I think also, there's a real problem in general with accessibility of science, which I think is contributing to some of it. So I agree with you. I totally blame the adversarial process. I've had to tell several law firms that I won't work with them because they've represented some clients where they bring in people like Jean Mercer or Joan Meier to argue that there is no such thing as parental alienation. And then on another case, they ask me to come in and argue that there is.
Oh.
And I've told them that's so unethical. That's like saying there is no child abuse and then there is child abuse. What? Yeah. How can you live with yourself?
Yeah, that's
like, and I've told they're just the last 4 months, I've turned down 2 law firms and I asked them, have you ever represented a client where you brought in experts to say there is no such thing as alienation? I ask them point blank, because if they do that, I say, you are undermining science. You're confusing the courts. You're presenting opinions in court that aren't empirically validated. And so, and I send them a whole bunch of stuff and I try to educate them, but they don't want to be educated. They just want to represent their clients. So,
yeah.
But I think the accessibility of research is also a problem, because if you've ever tried to access a study, for example, like if you're a student, you can get studies through your library. Your library can get it, or they can get it through interlibrary loan, you know. But journals are expensive. People think that because I publish, I don't get any money for publishing. Zero. The only people who make money are the journals.
Right.
And so when you go to pay to get an article, you're paying the journal. But you don't have to go to the journal. You don't have to go and pay it. Just email the author. They'll send it to you. I just am not allowed to publicly post my articles because that violates copyright laws.
Right. You're giving the journal the first dibs and
But I can use it for educational purposes. Like I can share it if I'm doing a training. I can share my articles. If I'm teaching a class, I can share my articles. So there are some options where I can share the PDF or the article itself.
Yeah, that's great.
If you ever have a hard time, if you have an article you want to read, and I really encourage people to read the original, even though it might be hard to understand, and you could always ask questions. Most people who publish are happy they're happy anybody's even reading what they wrote, and B, they're happy to explain it,
Yeah.
I know sometimes the statistics and the methods can be confusing for people who aren't scientists, but and I've read some really good studies, but then when you read the person's interpretation of them, they're wrong. Totally, like there's nothing that they actually did in their study that ties to what their conclusions are. In fact, there was a group of I emailed a group out of Australia. They published a paper on false allegations of sex abuse, and they reported in the paper that about, I think it was 20 or 30% of the allegations that were made in Australian courts, the court determined that they were deliberately misleading, meaning that the parent was making a false allegation of abuse with the intent to try to mislead the court to get, so they had come to that conclusion. So they reported this in the paper, and I thought, wow, that's pretty crazy. That's a lot, right? Yeah. But then in their conclusions, the author said, essentially, they argued two points of view, even though they were the same point of view, that the courts weren't getting it right and they just weren't believing mothers. So I emailed them directly and I said, okay, I found your paper really interesting. The results were very striking. But my question for you is, how did you determine whether they got it wrong? Like, I'm assuming that the court probably has a lot more information than you do. Like, you don't have like all the police reports. You didn't have all of that. All you read was the conclusions of the court.
Right.
So I would probably assume that the court had a lot more evidence to review before they came to that conclusion. So can you please tell me where you found information to come to that conclusion yourself?
Yeah, sounds familiar.
They wrote back to me about 4 months later, or 3 months later, because this is pretty recent. And they gave me this really long, detailed explanation, but they still didn't answer my question. And so I emailed back. I said, okay, well, show me where in your data you actually looked at whether the allegation was true or not. Where did you actually find that so that you can draw that conclusion? They haven't responded to me, and it's been a month. Yeah. So even if you read a paper and all the data looks interesting, you get to the end and you'll say, oh my gosh, how did they came to this wrong conclusion entirely? Like,
well, and that's dangerous. That's dangerous.
Very dangerous,
right?
Because is what's used to change laws.
Yeah, and then you have people that come in there and say, oh, well, 30% of courts,
are getting it wrong.
getting it
even though
wrong in
that's not
domestic
what
violence cases,
that's
right?
not what their data
It's
said.
right. It's so
Mhm.
dangerous.
Yep.
And especially, that I take my role here at New York Families for Tomorrow, and I work with someone from National Parents Organization and American Institute of Shared Parenting and the Father's Rights Group and Amazing Mothers Without Custody. We all, between the 5 of us, we take our role. I don't want to use that term gatekeeper because it has such a bad stigma, but we are the gatekeeper of the information we put out, because we want to make sure that our followers, our members, if they're sharing stuff from us, we want it to be dead accurate and on.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
I don't
Mhm.
want anything like that, like we just said, like, oh, 30% of courts getting it wrong after, because someone read a study, they read the conclusions, they didn't read the methods or the results, and
Mhm.
that's it. So
Oh yeah,
I
and I think
realize
and we need a lot more people to challenge other people who are publishing this stuff to
Yeah.
say, just clarify for me. I mean, and they haven't responded to me. So sadly,
Yeah,
what that
yeah,
means now is that I need to, and their data is public, which is great, supposedly. They sent me a link so I could get the data. So I'm going to go in and look. They haven't told me where to look because it's clear to me they didn't they didn't look at it in their data.
Yeah.
So now what I have to do is look at their cases, and I'm going to see if maybe I can get a graduate student or somebody who'd be interested in this project to go and find those cases
Yeah,
and look at that one question that they didn't ask,
right.
but that they came to a conclusion about.
Oh,
So we'll go and do it. It's not a replication. It's just saying, okay, well, let's see
we're
let's
just
see if that's
verifying.
actually true or not. Did the
Right.
court get it wrong
Right.
or
Good-
not?
Good point. Good point. I mean, we have this one instance where we have a state representative here who sits on a board, or I would say committee, where he's looking at reforming some of the Child Protective Services measures, and looking at that agency and seeing where, things could change, which is good. That's a noble cause. We met with him on public record. We had a meeting with him, and we were discussing shared parenting bill and what was in it and what it is. And the same representative, and I'm actually going to put his name out there, Assembly Member Andrew Hevesy, he flat out told us that he doesn't know much about family law. And because my partner used the word alienation, but as not as in parental alienation, but isn't like describing like, alienating behaviors, like
Mhm.
Mr. Hevesy came to the conclusion, says, and real quick, I just wanted to let you know that, parental alienation science is junk, isn't it? It's junk science, right? We're like, oh, okay. Like, we weren't even talking about that. We're like, okay. So the meeting ended, and my colleague, Jason, he goes, you know what? I'm going to, like you said, I'm going to offer him some education. And he sent him some studies and some reports and some literature on it, to hear nothing. So come to find out, the same representative who sat there and says it's junk, it doesn't exist, I don't know much about family law, is the main sponsor for CARES law, which is a bill here in New York, which defines parental alienation, then tells you can't use it in any kind of family court case, and totally reforms our domestic relations law. So the sponsor of this bill, who publicly told us he knows nothing about family law or parental alienation, that it's junk, turned around and defined it and reformed family law.
Yeah. Yep.
That's I have a problem with that.
Yeah. Well, even like the very first person, like Dr. Bill Burnett found, like the very first person who was quoted as ever saying that, nobody ever looks back and sees that he retracted that statement. He said first it was junk, and then he said, you're right, it's not. But nobody remembers that. And it keeps lingering and lingering. And so like the paper that we're about to publish, knock on wood, is we're completely challenging that. It's a ridiculous statement.
Right.
It's another science denial tactic.
Yeah.
Designed to try to undermine and protect abusive parents, essentially.
Yeah.
It all boils down to just beliefs that women can't be abusive.
Right.
Because when you look at and you change some of the language that's used to describe abusive fathers that a lot of these domestic violence groups use, they're describing alienation.
Mm-hmm.
But when you try to then say, well, look, moms do it too, moms do the same thing. Oh no, she's just protecting them.
Yeah, yeah,
No,
that whole mama
it's just
line thing.
yeah, I mean that's what it boils down to. It just boils down to a gender bias about violence and beliefs that all violence is coercively controlling abuse, which is Joan Meier's position. Believing that nobody gets it right, that you should always believe children, you should always believe women when they say they're being abused. No, they wouldn't manipulate anybody to do that. Like, that's really what it all boils down to. And it's a false narrative. It's a because the data doesn't support that at all. National
and
statistics.
nor should our society support that at all.
No.
Especially in 2022, when we accept, transgender men on swim teams, and we accept, the gender fluidity. And if that's the case, then I think it's time that we accept, remove some of those gender stereotypes and violence then, if that's the case, because you can't have it both ways. You can't sit there and say, we're fluid, we accept all, we all have equal rights, we all need to be accepting of all of this, except that. Not that.
I think there's definitely a generational difference here. I don't know. Some of my colleagues who are my age have been commenting about how a lot of the women who are behind a lot of these bills and the research are a generation older than us.
Okay.
I mean, granted, there are some younger people who are kind of their followers, right? But a lot of them, I know a colleague of mine interviewed a lawyer or an academic who was at a law school, not Professor Meier, but somebody else. And she said, well, what do men want? They already get more parenting time than they usually do. Like, why do they want more? I mean, and she said that point blank. And I'm like, what? It's just unbelievable. Like, they think that, hasn't it already come far enough? Aren't men happy enough, like, that they're getting something? As if, it's kind of like as if women should be okay that they can work, not get promoted. It's like, it's the logic is completely flipped. Like, women should have, like, I have a paper that is about to be published where we talk about this theory that's it's based on it's based on spheres, and that how historically men and women have had very different spheres of life, right? Different places that they occupy in society. For women, it's a lot of times been home, right, and family, but that's changed a lot. And because of that, the spheres have overlapped, right? And there's a lot of confusion then about roles that men and women have. And we've been doing that for a while in the workplace, for about 100 years or so in the US. There's been a lot of shift in how women enter, go to the workplace. There's a lot of changes that have happened. In the family life, though, that's relatively recent.
Yeah.
Really, arguably, I would probably put it 70s and 80s.
I was going to say 80s. Yeah.
Yep, that's like really, and that's why we see the divorce. That's coincides with when the divorce rate went up. Fathers wanted to be more involved, because their fathers weren't involved. So I think because they're for a lot of reasons. But that's a historical shift I think we've seen, and I wrote about that in my book that I published in 2016. About kind of where I think it came from, at least in Western societies. Right now, I'm doing some research where we're collecting data in non-industrialized or less industrialized countries, such as Colombia, Uganda, and I think Vietnam is the other country. So we're collecting data there, nationally representative data, to try to see like what it looks like in those countries, because I think it's a little bit different. I think that there is more gender-based violence in those countries than there is in westernized countries, like or industrialized countries, but we don't know that. We don't know, so we're looking at that. And if it's gender-based violence, I do know that alienation does happen. Even in my graduate students doing some research in Tanzania right now for her dissertation, and it's happening there, but it's going to look a bit different, right? Just because I think culturally there's a lot of differences, and so it'll be really interesting to look at that and see how it plays out in those families. So
Yeah, I'm using a national study. Right now I'm doing a paper, not to be published. Of course, I'm undergrad, so I can't publish anything. I can't do any studies. Uh, can't
Yes, you
conduct
can.
anything.
Yes, you can, depending on where you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the SUNY process in New York is a little tedious. I wouldn't allow them credit for anything. Uh, However, I'm planning this, this study where we're looking at relationship, the quality of relationship between father and daughter and teen pregnancy rates. And I'm using this one study, again, a non-industrialized nation, for one of my sources. And my professor is like, well, I don't know if I want you using that study. I said, well, I think I'm going to keep using it because like it has comparable data to the relationship status, which in turn shows that it's not just like you said, like a Western, society issue. I think it plays an important role. And she really was like persistent and like, well, if you could explain it and if you could justify it well, I'm like, why don't you just leave that up to me when I write my paper? Like
Right,
and
right.
see what you think when it's done. So with PA being, like you said, since 2016, it's kind of blown up, the studies, the data that's available. Where do you see it in 5 years from now? Where do you think this is going to be?
That's a good question. I have had a lot of more people and a lot more professors reach out to me to do and collaborate on research, which is exciting. And not surprising, a lot of them are either alienated parents themselves or they were alienated as children. And so I have a lot of new collaborations. So I'm hopeful that there's more people starting to do research on this. I can understand why a lot of people don't, because A, you get attacked all the time. And B, it's like the worst, in my opinion, one of the worst forms of child abuse. I mean, it's so bad on so many levels, and it affects so many systems, and so many people are involved, and there's so much misinformation and so much I can see why nobody wants to touch it, because it's really hard work to do, especially for a young professor, right? If you're a young scientist who's trying to get tenure, who's trying to make a name, it's really difficult to do that, so I am happy though that there are some people now reaching out, or their kids are older and they feel like they're, if they're actually being alienated themselves, it's really painful and it's really hard to do the research. But a lot of people aren't motivated to do it unless it actually has affected them. So,
right.
And so I think that in the next 5 years, I'm thinking there's going to be more people studying it, which will be great because we need more perspectives. We need more, just approaches, more people in other disciplines looking at it. For example, like there's some great work by Christina Sharp out of University of Washington. She's a communications professor. She published 2 papers last year or the year before, and really interesting qualitative work looking at the perspective of targeted parents. And which is great. Finally, there's more people in other fields looking at this, and from different perspectives, and just purely scientific perspective. And and it's refreshing to read that work, and because it's not advocacy driven. It's not designed to. It's just scientific work, trying to understand it. So I think, in my opinion, the best way forward to battle the critics out there is just to keep doing the best research we can, and publishing it in the best scientific journals we can. And so I think that's happening. And I think, just seeing how much has been published over the last few years, it's accumulating fast. So I don't see that changing.
Yeah.
I think the trajectory has just been going up.
Okay.
There's a nice balance of qualitative and quantitative studies, which are both very important for understanding what's going on. And so I think that's only going to increase. I think we're doing a lot more international. There's a lot of people working on this internationally. This is not some field of study that only stayed in the US. There's lots of studies in other countries, which is great.
Well, I see you're a part of the Global Action for Research Integrity for Parental Alienation there. That's an international organization, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah, we have a book launch coming up.
yeah,
It's yeah, I mean, right now, so there's a lot of movement, I think, going on to try to identify when there's false information published or misinformation, because in other sciences, if somebody publishes wrong data or incorrect information that's misleading, you have to correct the scientific record. You know,
right.
this is why you retract, for example, Andrew Wakefield's vaccine studies, right? It's like, because it's retracted because it wasn't, he fabricated the data, or he like completely, like what they call p-hacked, or kind of manipulated the data. And so in that case, if you have millions of lives relying on immunizations, then if your data is wrong, that's a major public health problem. Same
Yeah.
thing with parental alienation. When people are misquoting the work of people like others, that's wrong and needs to be retracted. It needs to be corrected. And so that's why the Global Action for Research Integrity and Parental Alienation was developed, is to especially call attention to some of how Dr. Richard Gardner's work has been completely warped and mischaracterized by people, not just in the US, but in Mexico and Portugal, Spain. I mean, it's unbelievable how they've twisted the words that he said. And people don't go and read the original work to see what he actually said to
Right.
better understand it. And so that's why we set that up. And so the idea would then be to try to start holding publishers accountable, because it violates international law to publish false information or misquote people. It's, or, calling, for example, Richard Gardner a pedophile. I mean, that's slander or libel. I forgot what it is for printed words, but I mean, that is completely, I mean, at that point, the work should be retracted, or there should be fines, there should be corrections to the work.
Yeah, right.
And, so you'll see if you get access to the digital book when it comes out after the release, you'll see a lot of examples of attempts that have been made to try to correct the scientific record and failures in doing that. And so we need to start mobilizing some international efforts to correct that information, because it's being misused.
Yeah.
Especially to changing laws and policies like what you're
Right.
seeing in New York.
Right.
But we see it all over. It's happening everywhere. Like in Mexico, it's influencing policies on child protection issues there. It's all over. So
Right. And it's important too, like if you know, so I'm a bit more involved in more of the political scheme of family, science and family dynamics. And it's just amazing to me that, they said, oh, well, we have all this new science and we want to make all these reforms and we want to make it better. And then like they don't listen to any of the recommendations or from the research, and they just go and do whatever they want anyways. And then like it's in stone, and then like 10 years later, it's like a complete failure. And they sit there and say, oh, well, we don't know. And it's just, I want to prevent that. I mean, it's good for society as a whole. It saves money. It's fiscally responsible. It's socially responsible. And it's like, I rather have someone wait on a policy change than get it wrong.
Right.
And so that's what we're trying to do here in New York. We're trying to like pull them back. Just please just give us like a year, like just relax, like don't do this yet, because once it's done, then you're fighting a whole new beast, and trying to come up with ways to infiltrate that. And it's really tough. It's really hard, especially with when we're dealing with child abuse, and who's responsible for that. It's very, very tough. And kind of changing gears here a little bit, you went back to saying how I want to go back to how you had the video of your did you have just one group of the in one of your studies you had actual video footage, and how was that like the parents and the children and the professional, and you were just kind of like watching them interact, or was it?
No, so Linda Gottlieb has
Oh,
created, it's our Turning Points for Families program. And she was trained under the Salvador kind of Minuchin model of family therapy. And part of the model that she uses always uses videos, like they always record the family therapy. And they often use those videotapes for supervision. So for example, like, so as a clinician, you would work with the family, you record it, and then you would have somebody who would supervise your work or a collaborator who would give you feedback and what you could have done differently, et cetera.
okay.
And it's kind of a standard practice for people who use that model of treatment. And so she's always done that. That's always been part of her practice. So when she started developing her Turning Points for Families program and implementing it, that's just part of the process. So every intervention she does, it's 4 days long, it's recorded, the whole thing. So
Wow.
she had tapes from all the families
Wow.
that were part of it. So I wasn't there. I wasn't, it was just videotaped. And
Amazing.
then we just got permission from the parents to share the videos with us. And some of them weren't able to because their lawyers were saying no, even though they were protected. We had a National Institute of Health certificate of confidentiality so that
Okay.
nobody could actually get access to it in case the other parent tried to raise problems. But I mean, everything was de-identified. We didn't record names, we didn't record
Right.
anything about the families. So there's nothing in the paper that you can look at and see who was who. And so, but yeah, so we were able to get those videos, and I collaborated with Dr. Tamara Afifi from University of Santa Barbara on that study, where she doesn't do parental alienation research. And you'll notice that most of my papers that I publish, my research papers, I collaborate with people who don't do this work at all,
Okay.
or who not alienated, they were not affected by it. They just have an expertise, like maybe in statistics or some other thing. And the reason I do that is to make sure that the work is objective as possible, right?
Sure.
And I like to collaborate with people and get different perspectives on the work. That's something that's probably the more enjoyable part of the scientific process, is working with other smart people who, and we share ideas and we develop, new things and new methods. And that's a fun part of collaboration.
Sure.
And so, but I worked with her and her team, they were the ones who coded the videos. So nobody on her team had any experience with parental alienation that we know of. They were just trained to code certain behaviors. So when they're watching the video, they just recorded like what the people said and did. And so that way it could be as objective as possible. It wasn't me coding it, looking for things that I expected to see, because that's how, whenever, as you learn science, you design your studies in ways that can be as objective as possible. I mean, nothing's perfectly objective, but we try to be, as a scientist, I try to be as objective as I can.
Yeah.
So that way I'm just reporting what we're seeing.
Great. And would you say it's a good idea? Let's say a family, wanted to take that route of therapy altogether. And we know usually, alienators, they have those borderline personality issues. They have, a whole array of emotional issues that may prevent them from even stepping foot into a therapist's office. But would you recommend families going that route to having that therapy together?
No, you wouldn't. Not in cases of parental alienation.
No.
Parental alienation is just it's just a word to describe a child that's been weaponized against a parent by an abusive parent. You would never recommend family therapy for a family where there's been battery or intimate terrorism, right? That's not what they recommend. You don't recommend that they go to mediation. You don't recommend, and that's what this is. This is what I think, sadly, a lot of domestic violence proponents or I guess the advocates don't really understand, is we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about very abusive people. It's just, I don't see that there's a gender difference in who does it, because we don't see in national statistics that there's really any gender differences in who the abuser is. They don't see that. So that's why they're so against what we have to say. But parental alienation, that's not a term that's used to describe the whole family. That's a term that's used to describe what happens to the kid who's been aligned with the abuser and been weaponized against the other parent. And when that happens to the child, that's what we call parental alienation. So it's not you know, when people try to talk about it, it is a family dynamic. It's a product of a family dynamic is what we're talking about.
Gotcha.
And so that's why family therapy, you can't do that. You can't force a person. It's not good. It's not going to work to have that person go and try to work with somebody who's abusive.
Right.
That's like putting a child in a room with a bully and asking them to work it out. You can't do it.
That's tough.
Especially with kids. So especially with kids.
Well,
and so yeah.
I love the clarity on that, because I think that, you know, myself included, I think there was definitely some kind of like fogginess there of how, you know, the adjectives we use to describe the players and the family and who's who and who represents who. So that's great. And, you know, we have in like personally my situation, we have now an alienator who is attempting to get into therapy with us because they don't like what's going on. You know,
of course, yeah. Well, because they lose control. I mean, so you have to
Yeah.
understand that it's an abusive person.
Yeah.
And what drives them is power and control. And the minute they feel like they lose power and control, they have to get their hands on it and they have to try to fix it. So it goes back in their way to alleviate their anxiety and their stress. And, you know, the most effective strategies I've seen, especially, you know, Dr. Yvonne Parnell has developed an aftercare program for severe alienating parents. There's also some intervention programs that have been developed and are kind of working towards evaluating. I've been helping them kind of evaluate it, are looking at more mild and moderate cases. Okay. Mild alienators, you know, sometimes they're, Dr. Darnell's called them naive alienators. They don't always know what they're doing. They don't know that they're kind of inducing loyalty in the kids and making them feel bad. And, you know, but usually you don't see those kids becoming severely alienated. It's very mild. And those parents are the most amenable to change, right? Because they're usually just not always, it's their own history that they're replaying, you know, in their family.
Sure.
They're not always kind of aware, or the stress of the divorce, and you know, sometimes that can be alleviated after after things settle and all that. But the moderate and severe alienators, you have to be more actively, you know, and deliberately doing some of those things in order to make it happen. And so they're more active in getting the children to reject the parent, right? You know, they're more active in that influence, and they're more active in getting other people to help with the process.
Yeah.
And they know what they're doing. I mean, they know, they may not know all that they're doing, but they know some of it.
Yeah, they have that like initial intent behind.
Yeah,
you know,
there's an intent. Yeah,
there's a goal in mind, and the goal is to be the most loving, caring person your kid ever needs and ever wants, and nobody else matters. And
yeah, because they need the power and control.
Yeah,
you know, and they need that, and they're also, maybe sometimes there's the ones that just really want to punish the other parent, and so yeah, so in that case, I mean, it's really hard to work with them. I mean, because they're, in a lot of ways, I mean, they're abusive. They're like any other kind of abusive person, right? We know from the domestic violence research on batterers that they're really hard to treat. They don't want to engage in therapy or counseling often. They blame everybody else for their problems. And we see that with alienators too. They blame everybody else. And they say it's the other parent's fault. They say it's, I mean, because they're the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, we just call them something different because we study what happens to the kids.
Right.
And a lot of domestic violence research, they don't study what happens to the kids. They only study like the long-term effects. They don't study what it means for a child to be weaponized.
Yeah, the effect on the child.
How do you get a child to turn on a parent? The only way you can get them to turn on a parent is to make the child feel that that parent never loved them, abandoned them, or is unsafe. And so all the alienating behaviors you see these parents do are designed to make the child feel that way, because that's how you get them to turn on them and align with them, right? Yeah. And so you see this in abusive families too, or other kinds of abusive families. The children will align with the abuser. And you may, it seems counterintuitive. Why would you? Well, because they have more power. You know, they have, so, and the children are dependent on them.
They're holding all the cards. They have to go to that. Children can't defend themselves. And
and there's some kids who are, by some miracle, they'll say all the words, but they won't internalize it. I've seen a few cases of that where it'll look like really severe alienation, but then the minute that the court steps in, the kid's like, thank God you finally saved me from that.
Oh, okay.
But a lot of other children do internalize it, right? And I mean, they'll carry it their whole lives, sadly, you know, for some of them. So, but we don't know a lot about what makes children resilient to it. You know, we're still learning.
That's a good, that's a new, that would definitely be a new field to break through and just see, look at some of those survivors, I would call them at this point, and like, how'd you do it, But
Yep. And it's funny because whenever I've testified in court, I'll kind of go through the research and what we know, and I really explain the terminology, to make it very clear what we're talking about, because it's not to be confused with loyalty conflicts. That's a very different dynamic. And what's been really great is, like, since testifying in a few cases more recently, now I've been invited to go and train judges. I'm not going to say what states because I don't want that to be undermined by the critics out there. But the judges, after I gave I've had several judges say after my testimony, they're like, oh my God, why didn't I hear you when I was on the bench 20 years ago?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's about me, but the science is advanced enough that it's more clear, that when you can explain what's actually what's happening to children, we know the processes now, we understand them. We know what makes parental alienation different than other kinds of family conflict. We know how to differentiate them. We know how to measure it. I mean, we've learned so much. There's still a lot to learn, but we've come a long way. And when you really explain it to judges, or at least in my experience, when I really explain it to judges and they're wanting to hear it, like, now I'm going to be training three states in the U.S. will get training by me over the next couple of months. So if you're in one of those states, you might be lucky and get a judge who's got some new data.
Exactly. And, and that's part of what our organization does too, is the educational component to making sure we bring awareness and saying, hey, if you're a firm believer that parental alienation happens and that these are issues, then naturally, I would think you'd be a firm believer and approve of shared parenting from the start of divorce, because what we've seen in states like Arkansas and Kentucky, since they've had their bills passed in the past 2-3 years here, the conflict is down, the litigation is down, attorneys are reporting this. And we believe, and not scientifically proven, but we believe when that conflict is erased from the get-go, from the start, that PA is less likely to happen, because there's not that, winner loser mentality or control dynamic that somebody has to just keep grabbing for. And so that's what we're hoping for in New York here is, I feel if there was a study done in New York, you'd have millions of children who were affected.
And also, I think even in alienation cases, I've seen this in a number of families where if 50-50 custody is awarded, like week on, week off with the parents, even if the alienation is still going on, the children still have a solid quality time, block of time with the alienated parent that it can help buffer it. It doesn't stop the other parent. It doesn't mean that the children don't still have a preference,
right,
because they're being influenced, and it doesn't mean they still don't hold a lot of false beliefs,
right.
But what's nice about it though is it makes it harder for them to develop new false beliefs. I mean, they may have a lot of false beliefs about the past, but when they have that length of time and quality time with the parent, there's enough there to help dispute any new things,
Right.
And so you still have to work with some of the beliefs that happened in the past, but and so it does. But then when you have a parent who's violating that parenting time, which they inevitably do because they start feeling like they're losing control, that's when we see the negative outcomes in children. I published a paper on that a couple of years ago. It's like, it's not so much it is the parenting time and how much time you have, but it's more so like when you start seeing a parent violate it. That's the gatekeeping behaviors. That's really where you see a lot of the negative outcomes in children, is because it kind of reflects probably what else might be going on. I'm sure it's not just gatekeeping.
That's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of other stuff that
there's a whole lot underneath. That is there. And how do you propose, how do you propose someone can go about, like you said, is gatekeeping like an initial, should that be an initial signal to a parent that, hey, something's going on? Or what kind of signs do you think that a parent can look for, that alarm bells should go off and say, hey, I need to start, either documenting this, or, being a bit more sensitive to my kids' needs, or, what can they do to be aware that something is starting to happen to their family that is not normal?
Well, it depends. The answer to that really depends on if it's post or pre-divorce or separation. Because
Right.
a lot of parents will recall, well, it varies. Some families, they recall the alienation starting way before they separated.
Yeah.
There's people who are being alienated and they're not divorced, they're still
Right.
together.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's more common in divorced, separated families, but I could think of other countries where people don't get divorced very often. Like I've had students from China who say that alienation's a real problem there, but people don't get divorced.
Okay.
And like they'll have the whole family turn against a parent. I mean, essentially shut them out. Like, so they're like a stranger in their own home,
Ugh.
which would be really fascinating to study at some point
Yeah.
whenever I have, free time to go
Yeah.
and study a new thing. But yeah, I mean, early on, what people usually report is that they feel like the other parents started undermining their authority in the home in front of the children. They might shut them out of activities, like shut them out of not let them put the kids to bed, for example, like kind of leave them out of some of the more direct care or doing activities with the children away from the parent. So they'll start to notice that those things happened early on. Um, and then like afterwards, yeah, gatekeeping is a big one, finding excuses, letting the kids think that they can start to choose, like, I don't feel very good, I don't want to go to parenting
Yes.
time. And a lot of parents will be like, okay, well, they try to be nice. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
that is exactly the time when you should have your parenting time. So the kid knows that when you're sick, I can also take care of you.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's really hard. Every time I kind of sometimes talk to some parents, I'm like, I don't do a lot of coaching because I don't have time for it. But when I have, I'm like, you cannot waver on your time. You have to maintain your time. In fact, that is the number one thing that they say at moderate stages of alienation is get your parenting time back and get as much of it as, not as much, but at least 50-50, get that quality time, because that's the only way you can maintain an attachment. That's the only way you can maintain it or repair it. These people who say, oh, well, we just need to ease into it with therapy, after alienation's gotten really bad. That's not how you rebuild an attachment. That's not a real, that's like the worst, that's like, because they're still in the care of the person who's abusing them, and
Yeah, they just
so
go home and they're grilled about it, and
they get like 1 hour a week with the parent. That's not going to fix it.
No.
We know it doesn't fix it. There's so much research out there that shows it doesn't fix it. In fact, it makes it worse. So no. So it won't help, because any step forward is 3 steps back, because it'll be too threatening to the alienating parent and they'll undermine it. They'll say, oh, we have to go to a different therapist, or they won't. So
Yeah, it's been, I could say personally, my spouse, it was a really weird dynamic where there was an attempt to alienate the kids from their father, but it didn't work. So it was switched to me, the stepmom.
oh yes, that's exactly my experience. So, and that's a lot of step parents.
And I was like,
yeah,
you could literally, I almost could see like the tide in the ocean, like where it started and where it began. I was like, oh, look
smiling
at
over there.
this.
That's
It's like,
exactly, yeah. I mean, your plight as a step parent's always bad, doesn't matter. But in alienation,
yeah. And
it's
so it's so strange because
and I would like to study it. I almost feel like that would be too close to home for me too. Like I couldn't. I can study the alienation part better because I've seen it happen directly in front of me, right? In terms of my husband and other people close to me, other friends, I've seen it. But
where do you think
as a
that
step parent is it's a different experience, because you don't ever want to feel like you're like, because they're not your biological children. In a lot of ways, I resonate with a lot of kind of LGBTQ parents who are dealing with alienation. Like if they're not the bio parent, that's kind of how I feel as a step parent, even though I'm still a parental figure.
Right.
Like a lot of them, they are the parental figure, so it's not the same. But as a step parent, like if you've been a step parent to a child you've been in their life since they were very young,
Yeah.
and you're being alienated them still, as teenagers, it's a different experience though, because you don't have the rights, you don't have the. I know people who've divorced people who were being alienated, and they still love their stepchildren, but they're not their stepchildren anymore, and now they're shut out of their lives.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's anyway, but yeah, that
And
is a whole nother can of
and I
worms.
think
I would love to study it, but I think
and
it'd
I
be too
think
hard.
I think coming at it from the reason I'm still adamant at fighting that and addressing that is because it's abuse, it's child abuse. I don't
Mhm.
care who is the target. You know,
Right,
we have an adult, you know, abusing children.
right.
So I will never step away
Yep.
because that would be like, what if they were hitting them and the kids came with black eyes and bruises? Like,
Mhm.
oh nope, not my problem, not my kids. No, never,
Yeah,
never
no.
do that. But it's very interesting that, you know, people use these tactics to gain upper hand. And I just find family dynamics and social science just so interesting. And like you said,
Mhm.
I think you brought up like 15 new topics of research you want to go do now. Um, it's never
Yeah,
ending. It's
we
always
need more. Yeah, there's so much more to study. We know a
yeah.
lot.
There's a lot.
People act like we don't know anything. We know a lot.
Yeah.
We just there's always more to know. I mean, that's why that's why I think the science is what we call generative. If you have a field of study that isn't accumulating and isn't rapidly growing,
Mhm.
that's kind of a dying field. It means like, it's not that all. It might be interesting, or maybe it was just kind of a unique thing we see with one group.
Yeah, okay.
No,
Yeah.
this is something we see worldwide. We're seeing it manifesting lots of different ways. It's because abuse happens
Yeah.
worldwide.
Nice.
What kills me is like, I see some arguments coming out of the UK where they try to say, well, there haven't really been any studies on prevalence or anything in the UK. So we can't draw any conclusions from any other studies about how prevalent it is.
Hmm.
Like, that's like the dumbest argument I've ever heard. That's like saying that we haven't done any studies on child abuse in Papua New Guinea, so it doesn't exist there.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like, it's just, it doesn't make any sense. Of
Yeah.
course it exists, like you
Yeah.
could go do a study, but you can't say it doesn't exist just because there hasn't been a study
Right.
documenting it exists or not. But even then you do a study and then they'll say that's not good enough. It's not good enough. It's
Oh,
not good enough.
right. Yeah. It's always the bar is always rising. Correct. It's
That's
just
what
it's like
I
the
keep
standard.
saying, like, you can try to, and it's good to replicate. I mean, I replicate studies. It's very important to
Okay.
replicate,
Yeah.
but it comes a point where no matter how much replication you're doing, you're not going to please the critics. I've given up on that. A lot of people want to keep trying to address the concerns they keep raising. And I'm like, there's nothing we could do to address their concerns because no matter what research we do, it's not going to be enough for them.
Right.
We could
So
do the best study, like
it-
you could even, but the problem is a lot of the stuff we can't do. We can't do, when you study family violence, you can't do lab research. You can't
right.
experiment and put kids in one family or another. And yet that's the expectation that some critics are trying to put on this work.
Yeah.
They don't
Okay.
put that expectation on child abuse or domestic violence research.
Right.
They only put it on
Yeah.
parental alienation
I
research.
mean, a good comparison would be, and not to be too graphic, but are we going to sit and videotape a child molester molesting a child so we know the exact method and way he's doing it or she's doing it? No, we're not going to do that. You know, but I just find it interesting. What stuck with me and will continue to stick with me is when you were talking about Linda Godspeed and her videos. There have been a couple instances even in my life where I watched it happen. I watched like a switch like flip in a child for from when they're here and happy and they're generating new organic memories and good times, and then like they'll go to their room with their phone
Mm-hmm.
and they're
Oh
texting
yeah.
and they come out and they're shut down and their stomach hurts and they're sad and they're disengaged and I literally sit back and I'm like,
Yeah. Who are you? Yeah.
I just take
Because
it
the kid,
all
the
in.
child is, yeah, the child is, I mean, the child is being psychologically split. I mean,
Yeah.
they are completely splitting when you see that,
And I just take
and
it
it's
all
so,
in and try to like observe everything because I'm like, okay, like in my mind, I'm like time frame and how this happened. And then we'll get the phone and I'll go back and we'll see text messages of love bombing and,
Yeah.
you know, I bought you this, it's on its way. And, you know, I
Mhm.
can't wait to see you, 3 more hours, 2 more hours,
The
you
picture
know.
of your dog misses you. Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
That's what they do.
Oh,
It's the loyalty. They have to keep showing that they,
the rooms, pictures of their
yeah.
rooms, and oh, look what I did to
Mhm.
your room, and
Oh
you
yeah.
know,
Look what you're missing. Look what you're missing while you're not with me. Yep.
and what I
That's,
found kind of creepy in all this too is they would be sending pictures of the kids when they were younger.
oh yeah. Oh, they love to do that. Oh yeah.
So,
Yep.
but what's the meaning behind that? So, like, if a kid, an 8-year-old, is looking at a picture of themselves at 3 that the alienator sent to them during their, but they're with the other parent, like, what are they? It
Mhm.
just, it amazes me what that child is thinking at that time of looking at themselves.
Mhm.
You know, it just, it blows my mind that
Yep. So
that's what
that,
people.
well, because it makes them recall a time when they're more dependent than they were now, and they're a baby, and oh look, I'm the better parent. I have all these, they're trying to reestablish this parent-child bond through those pictures, right?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
on the flip side, that what we also see when I talk to a lot of parents, and in my case, again, I'm not going to pretend like there's no bias there, because there is. But I have talked to some parents who also see that, you know, that what was I going to say? You know, that like, you know, when kids recess back to like younger, you
Mm.
know, they so after like certain instances or events that, you know, or they get the kid back from like from vacation, and they're like
Yep.
mentally like 4 years younger, and they have, you know,
Hmm.
they have to kind of bring this back. um and we see it, I see it all the time, and
Well, what's really interesting is some of the clinicians I've worked with, and been getting involved in a lot more cases now where reunification happened, and the
oh,
kids were
okay.
successfully reunited, and now they're starting to kind of, start to move forward to try to hopefully reestablish a relationship with the alienating parent. Usually,
Mm,
the alienating parent hasn't gotten help,
right,
or they haven't done what they're supposed to do because they don't believe they've done anything wrong.
right.
And so, unfortunately, sometimes the kids don't ever have a relationship with them again because they don't go and get the help. But what's interesting is, like, during the reunification process, the people who've worked with the children right away and for the next few months, a lot of them have reported that the kids immediately regress back to an early emotional state when they're with the alienated parent.
Yes.
And what's interesting, and I want to do a study on this, but I'm trying to get them to write case studies about it, so there's some documentation, at least in the clinical literature, about it.
Mhm.
But what they're finding is, like let's say it's like a 16-year-old girl, and she's reunited with her mother or father, and then they'll go through a period of months where they just watch My Little Pony and just want their hair braided,
Yeah.
like when they were. And I asked them, I was like, is that when the alienation started? I said, oh my God, that is. So emotional, it's like we see with, like, people who abuse substances, they remain emotionally stuck at the age when they started using drugs.
Yeah, okay.
So you see, like, an emotional, like, even though they're developmentally adults, right? Or they might be almost, they're young adults, but emotionally they're stuck at the age when the alienation started. And unless they resolve that and and so it's interesting, and I think it's because they finally feel safe, like, so they're finally with the parent who they had been alienated against, right, or aligned against, and they're with them. Now they feel safe again, where they can go back to that place and kind of work forward, right,
Okay.
from that
Mhm,
point.
mhm.
And so it's interesting, because then by doing that, it doesn't, it takes a while, but it doesn't take terribly long, because the children, I mean, people have a natural desire to grow and change, and
Yeah.
but it does take, some time and a lot of healing. But it is not surprising that emotionally kids get stuck there. And so it does
Yeah.
not surprising to me when you say if they go back home for a summer, or go
Right.
back to the other parent, and then they come back, I bet that the age that they're acting is probably the same age that this is my hypothesis. I don't know, but just based on some anecdotal evidence from a whole bunch of different sources, I'm gonna guess that they're gonna regress, emotionally back to when the alienation started.
Yeah. No, that's
And then,
that's brilliant. You might have something there because the pictures that this parent sends the 8-year-old are from when she's 3 years old,
mhm,
and that's when
mhm.
they divorced.
Yep.
When she was
I
3.
bet you when she's a teenager, she'll still throw tantrums. So
Ugh,
just wait. Just wait.
yeah. Well, I won't even.
If my hypothesis is
Yeah,
correct,
yeah. I'm
um,
not even gonna go there, but yeah, there's yeah,
yeah.
there's
I mean, I've
that.
seen that. I mean, and I think
Yeah.
it would be really interesting to see,
I've actually
how you
Googled.
collect that data.
I've actually Googled, Jen, like, why is my 8-year-old still throwing temper tantrums?
That makes sense. Well, I mean, yeah, because I mean, they're mentally developing and all this other stuff, but emotionally, they're still traumatized. They've been
Yeah.
abused. It's they're adapting, they're surviving, right? But
And
it's
that's the saddest part because you know instead of at 3 when you don't really have the memory capability of knowing exactly like relationships and what's going on, like
Mhm.
she's only known divorce. And so I came into the picture shortly thereafter, and I've known her since she was like 3.5 or like 4 almost. And so I'm very prevalent in her memory of very early on memories. But halfway through, she was told I was abusing her. She was told I
Mhm.
was a bad person, that I my food sucked. I can't clean. I'm not fun. I'm mentally abusing you. I'm mean. All
Yep.
of that stuff. And now it's a totally different relationship where that child had an opportunity to have a really good, wholesome, loving
Yeah.
relationship with another
Yeah, I don't
adult.
know why people don't say like, geez, the more the merrier, man. The more people
Right.
who can love your
Yeah,
children and
absolutely.
provide like opportunities, I mean, it should not be seen as a threat. It should be seen as a good thing for your kids. I mean, it's
Right.
just so sad. It's
It
just,
really is. And we see
yeah.
a lot of that, and it's interesting. I'm going to keep an eye on it for the next few years. To see if that's something
This is
that,
my working. That'll be. I don't know how I'm going to do that study.
yeah,
That's probably. If
that's
you ask me, like, what are the research? I have like a big list of things like that,
yeah,
projects
no,
that I would
that's
love to
great.
do.
That's yeah, that's how
If
it
I
should
just
be.
had clones of me, or if I had other people, I have grad students. I'm like, please, if you want to, here's a list of possible topics.
Yeah, yeah,
Any of
yeah.
these, just pick them.
Right. Well, lastly, I won't keep you all day. I know we could talk on this topic forever. But lastly, is there any advice you can give advocates or parents that may be trying to bring awareness to parental alienation or change the status quo or get this in front of the right people at the state level? Any advice on how to do that and what they should be doing?
Uh, I have a hard time with that question because I'm not an advocate myself. People always try to rope me into doing advocacy, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I can't wear so many hats. I have to just, stick with what I'm good at because, as an advocate, you need good research, and there's not, there's so much research that needs to be done to deal with the critics out there. So
Mhm.
I've been trying to focus my energy on that. But I guess we've touched on a couple of the things so far is,
Mhm.
if there's a lot of articles that have been published and you may not have access to them. So get access. And if you don't understand it, ask somebody. Um, I'm usually interviewed on different podcasts. I don't even know what's out there on me on YouTube at this point. People always
Mhm.
email me and say, "Hey, I saw you on YouTube," but I'm like, I don't even know like what
Yeah.
video they're talking about. But I'll usually like talk about a new study that was published or something like that. So you can kind of keep up to date. I know there's a lot. People say there's not any information out there. I actually think there's a lot of information out there. It just hasn't been compiled in a digestible way for people to
Right.
understand it. Because I'm interviewed all the time, and I know other people are too. Like Bill Burnett's always on different podcasts and other. I mean, there's so much information out
Mhm.
there. I think it's just a matter of condensing it and make it easier for people to get. I know the Parental Alienation Study Group, pasg.info.
Mhm.
That's usually where there's a lot of information on there that's kind of attempting to digest some of it for people to use. I'm president of the International Council on Shared Parenting, and so we're trying to kind of get articles and other things like summaries of the best or like the top research articles on shared parenting. I know NPO has done the similar thing,
Mhm.
and so we're kind of trying to do that, looking at a lot of the international, try to blast the information out there. I know that we're trying to work with people to translate some of the research into like one pagers that you can bring to your legislators and stuff. I've done a couple of them on parental alienation. I know that some people at International Council on Shared Parenting are working on some for shared parenting. So once we get those documents done, we'll try to share them with as many people as we can, because then it'd be something you could hand to your legislator and say, hey, you know, here's the myths and truths about, you know, shared parenting.
Right.
We already have like 3 of them on parental alienation. So I could try to, I don't even know who I've shared it with, but I think NPO has it on there. They posted it on their website, you know, so, but those are useful because it cites then a couple studies that support why the myth is wrong and what the truth is. But I think, like, you know, trying to, you know, doing the work to kind of really digest, you know, the research and understand, you know, I can give you an example. Like, I get parents who email me saying, oh my gosh, Jean, you know, Mercer has published a paper criticizing your 2018 paper on family violence or something. And I'm like, you know, and then they want me to write something to comment on it. I'm like, okay, no, first of all, because first of all, if you're going to comment on a scientific, a journal, like, let's say somebody publishes something and people want to comment on it, you usually have, in a good journal, a good scientific journal, you have about 2 or 3 months to do that. Max. Okay. You don't do it 2 years later.
Right.
And you do it in the same journal. You don't go to a different journal to comment on science that's published in a better journal. Like so that's what like Mercer and Meier and all these folks are doing, is they're going to a really bad journal, like a professional journal that's not scientific, and they're publishing commentaries on papers that were published a long time ago, or they're publishing on papers that were published, you know, fairly recently, but either they couldn't get it published in the original journal because it wasn't scientifically valid, or they know they'll have an easier time getting into that particular journal because they know that their standards are so low, right? And that's been happening a lot in that one particular journal that we're talking about. But yeah, so I think kind of not overreacting when you see people citing, oh, here's a study, or here's a paper that proves alienation's not real, or proves that that it's not, or that it's a problem. It's just something that abusive dads say. Don't overreact. First, look at where it was published. You know, really kind of, you know, don't think too hard about it, and be ready, because when you do go to and lobby and advocate, that's what those people are coming in hand with.
Right.
The crappy research or crappy studies, crappy opinion pieces, as if it's some authoritative word on the topic. And it's not. And so but the problem is, I think, to be an advocate in this space, you have to know the difference between that kind of publication and science. And so I think to be really effective, you really have to become scientifically literate. Yeah. You know, and really get some crash courses on the method, scientific method. And, you know, you don't have to become an expert, but you have to at least know that, you know, some of the basics about what makes something a good study, differences between qualitative and quantitative methods. And one is not better than the other, despite what some people will say. And so, you know, but they all have their strengths and weaknesses, you know, and even the best well-designed study has weaknesses. And so this is why you do more research, because you try to replicate using different methods, different measures, different populations, just to see, do you find this over and over again? But you have to have good scientific literacy for that. And so I think if you want to be effective, that's the best way to do it, because then you'll know how to communicate the message better. Yeah. I can't do it. I mean, I'm invited to give talks all the time, like, oh, can you come and present to this panel of people in New York or Massachusetts, or, I mean, there's 50 states. And I can't do it, you know, and it's always like, you know, and I just can't, you know, and then not to mention the international stuff I've asked to do. And I'm
Right.
like, I can't, I'm like, I'm a professor and I need to do my research, you know, so,
Right. Yeah.
so,
Well,
but
that's,
that's
that's
the
why
job
we
for advocates.
have,
Those for you
yeah,
guys.
that's
Yes.
why we have these conversations. And that's why, I decided to take some social research classes in my undergrad because, it wasn't good enough just to sit there and say, oh, well, I have this degree in public affairs and I know how to lobby and I know PR and I know communications, but,
Right.
if I really want to affect change, I need to know the methods of change, and it's really important.
Well, yeah, and the best lawyers I've worked with are the ones that go and try to learn and understand the science behind it, because the only way that they can be effective in the courtroom
Yeah, you have to know.
is to, and so I have some lawyers who, I mean, they'll just text message me, hey, why is this better than this? Or why is, or, tell me what's wrong with doing it this way, which is good because most lawyers don't take any science classes.
Yeah,
They
right.
don't. They take business or they take poli-sci, but they don't take they don't take like scientific methods classes, or they don't take, psychology. They don't take any of the methods that you should know if you're going to try to work in this area. And so, and I won't work with a lawyer now unless they've read a lot of the articles that are seminal, in this field. I won't, just because as an expert, if I'm going in there to talk about science in the courtroom, they need to know what questions to ask me. Otherwise, I'm just up there like lecturing, and I know that's not what you could do. And so, if you're a parent, sometimes you may know more about parental alienation research than your attorney. Right. So you have to spend a lot of time educating them. And if your lawyer's not willing to do it, you need to find somebody who does and is willing to. And they're out there. I've worked with them.
Yeah, remove that pride.
Once they realize that, oh my gosh, a lot of my cases are like this, they will go out of their way to get training and, set up consultation appointments with me and or other people to learn about it. Or they'll go to trainings. They'll get their bar association to organize a training on it because they have the ability to ask for it.
Yeah.
And so as an advocate or a parent, you can do something about that. You can get your lawyer. It's harder to do it with a therapist because therapists will then think you're trying to push an agenda. So that's always a trickier fine line to do.
Yeah.
But I've had parents say, well, can you just talk to my therapist? Like, no, you're gonna, I don't think you want me to.
As my mom put it, when I got divorced, I was talking about it, and she wanted me to just tell the kids everything and why and how bad, again, that generational thing. And I was like, no, I'm like, that's a present they're going to unwrap all by themselves when they're older. And that's the thing with therapists, I feel. You know what? I'm going to let this therapist just slowly unwrap this little gift and see if they come to their own conclusions, because why ruin that for someone? Less you're being like, you're in danger, physical harm and danger. It's like, you just gotta let it play, not be too pushy.
If they're doing their job right, they'll find it. If not,
and
unfortunately, a lot of times they'll get manipulated, But
within 2 sessions, our therapist sat there about my stepkids and says, I see a lot of grooming and guilt. And she's like, we're going to start working through this. And that was a year ago. And I really think it saved a good chunk of our relationships as as a whole family.
Yep.
And then, we got mom who sits there and says, well, why are you going to therapy? I thought it was family for your family. And he's like, my kids are my family.
Yeah. Well, and that's the nice thing about family therapists is they have flexibility in working. Like, so they can sometimes work with one person alone. They can work with everybody. Yeah. I mean, because they're trying to treat different pieces of it. So
I love it. I strongly recommend it for, that more mild to, you kind of caught it. You're kind of trying to prevent a lot worse from happening.
Yeah, because it can give the kids what you want most of all is critical thinking skills at that age. Because I mean, I notice even my college students struggle with that, even from intact families, but alienated children in particular really struggle with it. And so, but I think it's very specific. They have a hard time with critical thinking about family, right?
Yeah.
For good reason.
Yeah. And healthy
And so,
boundaries.
because they're being corrupted, and so they're having a hard time making sense of the mixed messages that they get. So that's really important, I think, is for the therapist, if they understand that's what's happening, to help arm them with ways to kind of be critical of it. So
well, yeah. Do you have any questions for me?
no.
Your maybe coincidence.
Yeah.
But again, we're in New York, and we are doing our due diligence and making sure that the appropriate, accurate, credible information is being put out there from our organizations. So I'm sure in the future will be more talks, and I might take you up on that. Your new studies coming out, I might email you and say, hey, can I read that? Just so we could put together a good message, for the cause on the advocate side of things. But, from everybody here in New York, in our organizations, the MPO, Americans for Equal Shared Parenting, Fathers' Rights Movement, Amazing Mothers Without Custody, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the work you do. And I'm sure with our 5-year plan, maybe we'll see, like you said, a lot more research out there, a lot more people partaking in this, and just building a massive collection of research behind this, what we call parental alienation and the abuse that it is.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.